My name is Ray.
Hi, this is Michael.
Welcome to another episode of Ray's Economics Cluebook. Today, we're expanding upon our economics unit and talking about the circular flow model of economic performance. We're expanding how we measure economic performance.
Basically that's a fundamental part about macroeconomics.
So basically, circular flow model, one thing you notice here is that it shows how different, things in the economy flow around. For instance, we see money flow from households to a market for goods and services, which of course goes to firms, and that transfers back to the factor markets and money. Mm-hmm. Now, what even are these two markets? Well, first of all, the market for goods and services is basically where the market production of where firms produce to households. Mm-hmm. And in return, households provide factors to factor markets. Mm-hmm. Now remember, our factors are like our resources, our land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship.
Yeah, so the households, individuals, and families, they own those resources. Yes. And the factor market and goods and service product market, they're pretty much like intermediary.
Yes.
So through the intermediary, so we can see the flow for those inflow and outflow for the money, and we can also see the movement of the resource in exchange for goods and service.
Yes.
Okay, through the firms. Of course, firm convert those resources into the goods and service and it goes back to the households.
Yes.
Okay, so it's a pretty logical, inflow and outflow here.
A cycle.
Cycle.
And one thing you notice here is that for every input, there's an output.
Yeah.
For instance, the households, their input to the factor market is, of course, factors. And as a result, and as a return, they receive goods and services eventually through the market of goods and services. And you see here, the factor market provides money to households in the form of wages, rent, profit, or interest. And that money, the input of that, turns into an equal output of basically consumer spending to the markets and goods and services.
Sure. So that's also, we can sort of in exchange. For example, the household spending money through the intermediate market, like a Walmart, like Amazon.
Yeah.
Okay, and they pay the money in exchange for goods and service.
Yes.
And for the companies also, they provide the goods and service, and in exchange, Amazon and Walmart, they have to pay money to the company.
Yes.
Right? So,
exactly.
Yeah.
And so here's basically a more elaborate, but still the basic structure of the circular flow model from last slide.
Yeah.
Basically, it just elaborates on what exactly is inputted and outputted per se. For instance, here we see that households in the factor market, they provide, of course, we just talked about the four resources: land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. Mm-hmm. And then as a result, this input of factors turns into eventually goods and services produced by firms, which turns into goods and services bought by households. So the input equals the output.
Yeah, pretty much that's the same circular flow or simple circular flow chart like before. It's just elaborate a bit more. What's money, right? Spending and receiving and so forth.
Which we just talked about.
Yes. Okay.
And so here's the one that might look daunting at first, because all we're talking about right now are households and firms as the two subjects, and we only talk about two markets.
Yeah.
However, there are three things that basically you've probably heard about. You've probably heard about the government, you've probably heard about the rest of the world, and you've probably heard about financial markets. And so we add these three things in. But while this looks very complicated and daunting, just remember, total input equals total output. And once you remember that, this whole thing turns very logical, like a logical cycle, and you can just deduce your way through this. For instance, we are talking about our households, firms, factor markets, and markets of goods and services. Yeah. So now let's talk about the government, the extra entity. The government, of course, has a government purchases goods and services, for instance, like government subsidies or government purchases during times of recession, like we talked about in past slides. And governments also, of course, have government transfers like Social Security or welfare or food stamps towards households.
Yeah, like unemployment insurance.
Yes, unemployment insurance.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Now, of course, remember, total input equals total output. And the total output right now is purchases of goods and services and government transfers. So what are two inputs? Well, obviously, the first input you probably heard about is taxes.
Of course.
Yes,
collect money.
Infamous taxes.
So tax, yeah.
And the second thing that we always talked about, of course, is government borrowing. Yeah. Government borrowing comes straight from the financial markets, and it comes in the form of eventually debt. Mm-hmm. And so basically, the government borrowing and the government tax collection turns into the total output of purchases and goods and services and transfers. So very logical.
Yeah.
And of course, the government purchases of goods and services goes to the market goods and services, which goes to the rest of the world. This turns to an input of imports and then exports from the rest of the world.
Yeah, so it's actually the government is a perfect example about all inputs equals all outputs. But for each entity, it's the same story. For example, household. the total inputs is pretty much the wages, profit, interest, rent.
Yeah.
So the fact market, right?
However, they also have private savings as another form of their
that's the output, right?
disposable income.
Yeah. So all the inputs from the wages, profit, fact market
turns into private savings and consumer spending.
3 different outputs.
And taxes.
Spending, tax, and private savings.
Yes.
Okay. So that's so disposable income comes to the spending and private savings, right? And the tax is mandatory, so it's turning into Uncle Sam. So it's again input equals output. Okay. So we can actually just find out for each entity we have inputs and outputs.
Yes.
And total inputs must equal to total
It's just
output.
a cycle and a connection between everything in the economy and basically in the world.
Yeah. So it's basically, and also for each entity, they usually they have a money flow here, and they have a
Equal money flow out.
in exchange to the product or service. For example, government provide goods and service, provide transfer service, right? And then in exchange they get money here, right?
Taxes
From the
and
citizens and from the borrowers.
And their given services, it gets expanded as future outputs as either imports or maybe GDP for the firms, because we talked about in the past how consumer government spending can have impacts on GDP,
Sure.
which we'll expand upon more in the future, of course.
Yeah, so for each entity, I would strongly recommend people just to find the equation, get the total inputs and get the total output. Then this chart is becoming
You can deduce
much
it,
easier.
deduce it very easily.
Yeah, much easier to not to memorize but to understand.
Yes.
Okay.
So at the end of the day, just remember, we keep stressing, flow charts means total input, total inflow equals total output or outflow, because you have to get all your resources from somewhere as output and input. And so inflow equals outflow. And once you remember that, you can deduce your way through even complicated looking charts like this one.
Yeah. So and also just remember, all your service and product provided can be in exchange for the money flow.
Yes, and money flow has to just reinforces the fact that inflow equals outflow.
Yeah. Yeah. So
Yes.
exactly. So for each entity, just remember the inflow has to be.
And from that, for instance, we can deduce the total factor income to total spending, as we just mentioned.
Yeah. So then later on when we discuss about GDP, we have different ways to measure the GDP, right? So gross domestic spending product. I'm sorry.
It's all
GDP.
logic.
Yeah. So it's all logical. We have different ways.
Yeah.
Okay. But again, we basically on the same logics here. Total income must equals to total spending, for example, right? So total inflow has to be total outflow.
Yes, total disposable income. Yeah.
Okay. So I think that's pretty much about it. So I think that's a pretty good presentation, and I look forward for your next episode.
Thank
See
you.
you guys.
Next time.
Bye bye.